So now we're ready to move to the business of today's meeting, which is our lecture on the future of tropical agriculture. Dr. Edgar Turner, our speaker this evening, is a lecturer and curator of insects at the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge. He also, in addition to curating all those thousands of species of insects single-handedly, where there's 2 curators of vertebrates, I discovered, which I think is highly unfair, he also runs 2 large-scale experiments in Southeast Asia, investigating the role of habitat complexity in supporting biodiversity in human-modified landscapes. Agricultural areas have expanded dramatically in the tropics, providing food for the world's population, but they pose a severe threat to natural habitats and tropical biodiversity. A crop which has attracted a lot of negative press and has been associated with high levels of deforestation is that of oil palms. In this talk, Ed's going to consider some of the negative aspects of oil palm expansion, but also, and maybe surprisingly to many of us, many of the positives about this for biodiversity and its very high productivity. He'll also discuss ways that oil palm can be managed for biodiversity and beneficial ecosystem function, such as pest control and pollination, which may be key to actually having more sustainable tropical agriculture. So Ed, it's over to you, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. It's an absolute pleasure being here. Can you all hear me okay? Is the mic working? Right, so my name's Ed. I'm from the Museum of Zoology in Cambridge. I might look slightly haggard at the moment. We're due to reopen tomorrow after 5 years' worth of closure, so it's been quite an epic thing. So I've been replacing sleep with coffee, of course, another very important tropical crop. This is the museum itself. This is a very brief plug. If any of you are going to Cambridge tomorrow, or on Saturday really, we have a grand opening event, so do come along. Fantastic place to work. Very, very good place as far as insects are concerned, because we've got a wonderful collection of about 1.2 million insect specimens that enable us to study some of the effects of habitat change in the past. That's not what I'm going to talk about today, but by looking at these historical collections, of course, you can travel back in time, if you like, find out what Cambridgeshire was like, or even other parts of the world, actually, were like 200 years ago. So an amazing resource for that reason. So fantastic place to go. Do come along when you're in Cambridge. But what I want to tell you about today is a little bit about the area that I work in, which is really oil palm plantations in Southeast Asia. A bit about rainforests that which are being replaced by these oil palm plantations. The importance of working, I suppose, with industry, different types of conservation. And I'm going to finish off by thinking a bit about the future, the kind of what the agricultural landscapes might have to look like in the next 50 years. So that's a sort of shape for today's talk, if you like. It's going to be a little bit of a whistle-stop tour through really the challenges, I suppose, the ongoing situation and the potential solutions in the future as far as agricultural expansion is concerned. I'm going to start off by thinking a bit about rainforests. There's probably people in the audience who know far more about rainforests than I do. They're a fantastic ecosystem, of course. They're a biome which I've been working on, I suppose, for about the last 20 years or so. Fantastically diverse, I mean, off-the-scale diversity. For those of you who've visited a tropical rainforest, of course, that's very clear. If you walk through these areas, although they're percentage-wise, they only cover quite a small percentage of the Earth's land surface, in terms of biodiversity, they're extraordinary. I mean, 50% of the Earth's species, perhaps, of course, we don't really know because the majority of these have yet to be formally named. And just 1 hectare may contain over 400 tree species. Incredible off-the-scale diversity. That's, of course, the big stuff. When you start getting to the smaller things, the far more interesting insects, of course, then, of course, the diversity is even higher. And in these kind of ecosystems, there's this, I suppose, almost diversity begats diversity kind of ideas. If you've got a tree species which has got specific herbivores which are feeding on that tree species, and then, of course, predators feeding on those herbivores, perhaps parasitoids feeding on the herbivores, and even hyperparasitoids, things feeding on the parasitoids, feeding on the herbivores, feeding on the tree, we can sort of begin to see that once you've got this level of diversity in the habitat, well, it can expand. You can get really enormous numbers of species living in these relatively small areas. So that's the good news. Rainforests are incredibly diverse, of course, in terms of distribution. They're mostly around the tropics. They're in that kind of high light, higher rainfall environment, right the way around from South America through to Africa, through to Southeast Asia, where I do most of my work. Some quite classic work now has also identified rainforests as being biodiversity hotspots, if you like. This is work of Myers et al. Back in 2000, when they basically tried to draw lines around habitats to identify those areas which punched again above their weight in terms of number of species found there. But crucially, number of endemic species found there, number of species found in these environments but nowhere else on Earth. And if you kind of unfocus your eyes here, so this is the red of these identified hotspots, you can see there's the rainforest again. You can kind of see there's other habitats involved, but rainforests again are disproportionately represented in terms of those hotspots. They're incredibly diverse. They've also got lots of things that live there and nowhere else. The other criterion that Myers et al. Used was endangeredness, loss of habitat area. And unfortunately, again, rainforests tend to punch well above their weight in that way. These are areas that are being lost at a phenomenal rate as a result of agricultural expansion in tropical countries. So they're an incredibly diverse habitat. They're also an incredibly threatened one. I'm not telling any of you anything you don't know already, of course. But this is a key topic if we're thinking about understanding global biodiversity, understanding why these areas are so diverse, and also from my point of view, what can you do to try and maintain some of that extraordinary diversity going into the future? One of the secrets, I think, behind why these rainforests are so very, very diverse is perhaps to do with the structural complexity. These are incredibly complex habitats, not just in terms of number of tree species, but just in terms of physical complexity. This is some work from David Coombs, again from Cambridge a few years ago. They did a flyover, this LiDAR, aircraft flyover where they can work out the height of the trees and all sorts of things. And they identified, this is a tree, just one of the sites actually working in Malaysian Borneo. They identified the tallest tropical tree yet identified in the tropics, so just shy of 90 meters in height. I mean, these are enormous habitats. So again, imagine that degree of structural complexity. We're not just talking about number of species or structure within the habitat, just how far it goes up. Of course, you can have all of the different species living right up there in the canopy. Completely different environment, of course, compared to way down on the forest floor. So again, range of different habitats, range of different conditions, range of different environments, resulting, of course, in a range, very broad range, of different species using these areas. We're perhaps, in the last couple of decades, really getting to a point where we can actually access these canopy areas, begin to understand what's living above ground in these pristine tropical ecosystems. I've put some examples of this up here. These graphs down the bottom here, these pictures down the bottom here, are from these kind of LiDAR flyovers. So what essentially happens is you have a light aircraft goes over, it shoots, takes some hyperspectral images for this one, but it can also actively sense height of vegetation, all these kind of things. And these kind of remote sensing techniques have moved forward amazingly in the last few years, enabling researchers to understand an awful lot about the species composition, the diversity of tropical rainforests. There's also much more low-tech, but equally fascinating advances that have been made in terms of actually accessing the canopy or above the canopy in tropical rainforests. And this guy here put up his Roman Dial, fantastic name, is the University of Alaska. And he's pioneered techniques called Canopy Trekking, where he basically shoots a line up into these enormous topical trees and then a line over the next tree. And he essentially transverses from one tree to another, recording the space in these environments, recording the species that might be found right on the tips of these rainforest tree branches. Again, this is getting up close and personal to the most diverse habitats on Earth in a way that hasn't really been possible before. So really remarkable things. And of course, the result of all of this is a whole load of more information, understanding exactly what can be found in these incredible tropical environments. And of course, there are extraordinary species, some of which have been known for an awful long time. I've put this in because, of course, this relates to this gentleman over here, Alfred Russel Wallace, described this. This is Wallace's gliding frog, quite a common species from the rainforests of Borneo. And it really does do this as well. Fantastic thing. One of the things that Roman Dahl, the researcher I was talking about before, identified in Southeast Asian rainforests was a very, very open rainforest structure. And it's possible that that's led to the evolution of some of these extraordinary animals that are able to glide between habitats. Very energy efficient, of course, if you're living right up there in the rainforest canopy. And this is a wonderful example of it. This beautiful flying frog. It uses these extended flaps of skin between its feet, toes, to slow its descent. And it's also quite amazingly able to control where it goes as well. Of course, it's not just frogs. There are flying lizards, flying snakes even. Sounds like I'm making it up, but they really do exist. I've seen these things glide off a tree and, believe it or not, land on another tree and continue going. Extraordinary things. I mean, there's flying geckos as well. Rather similar to these frogs, they can have flattened feet, and they can flatten their ribs out a little bit as well, so they're also capable of gliding. So there's all sorts of amazing stuff living right above the ground in these rainforest areas. Now, of course, as you've probably begun to realise, I'm most interested in the tiny, the small things. So there's the large, and I count frogs as being quite large and charismatic things like frogs. But of course, there's all kinds of other, smaller diversity, which is living up in the canopy and being favoured, well, being benefited by this high structural complexity. One of the things our group's been interested in a long time are the epiphytes, the plants that grow on other plants, but non-parasitically, that live way up in the rainforest canopy. This is a really nice example. It's a thing called the bird's nest fern, Asplenium nidus. These reach enormous sizes up in the top of the rainforest canopy, and they can be stuffed full of insects, frogs, bats, all kinds of things, enormous densities of insects. And this fern here is a photograph at the top of a rainforest tree in Danam Valley in Malaysia. And that fern, to put it in scale, would comfortably sit from me to the wall in size. This is large enough for someone to sit in. So again, this is that kind of structure, this kind of diversity, which really can only be supported in the tropics. You need to have this constant supply of leaf litter. The leaves are constantly dropping their leaves. And also, of course, very high rainfall levels, meaning these things are able to catch the water, hold it, and make their own soil, make their own community, if you like, in a rainforest canopy. These are good houseplants. You can buy these from Tesco's. Not this size, though. Lower down the rainforest canopy, we've become interested in this group of organisms, which, again, haven't been looked at much before. If you walk through, I don't know if those of you who've been to a rainforest, if you walk through a rainforest area, or anywhere actually in the world, you'll kind of come out at the end and you've often got kind of bits of kind of tufts of stuff all over you, gets in your hair. It's a bit like kind of hair, like sort of old hair that grows around in the rainforest canopy. And this is fungal hyphae. There's several groups, it turns out, of tropical rainforest fungi, which have this interesting behaviour. Rather than kind of limiting themselves, if you like, to the forest floors, the decomposing litter there, what they can do is grow up into the lower canopy and make almost like a spider's web. And it turns out what they're doing is, and my colleague Jake Stanton describes it as nutrient piracy, where essentially what they're trying to do is intercept the litter before it gets down and there's all this competition on the rainforest floor. And of course this again is increasing the structural complexity of the rainforest. It's making it more diverse. So you have this whole networks of these beautiful hyphae which ramify throughout the canopy, collecting leaf litter, and of course providing a new habitat for insects. There's also some really special stuff that can live in these. Again, this is not everyone's cup of tea. I'm not showing you kind of photos of charismatic orangutans or anything like this, but these are equally beautiful. These are rather lovely harvestmen, which have a special association with these fungal hyphae. I'm going to try and see if this will work. Yeah. So you can see here, these strands here are all the fungal hyphae growing throughout the canopy, dead leaves caught. And then you can see here, here, and here. You see that? And actually another one there. These beautiful long legs. These are these beautiful harvestmen which they make enormously high densities in these fungal hyphae. And it's very likely, I think, you can see, they're sort of camouflaged to look a bit like the hyphae themselves. They're amazingly similar. So again, all of this is just a little example, but all of this amazing diversity within the rainforest basically being perhaps favoured by this existing structural complexity. You can experiment with this as well. So this is some work that Jake and I did a few years ago, where we knocked out some of these hyphae. So here we've got the number of species we found. These are in areas with the hyphae. These are in the areas where the hyphae have been removed. And you can sort of see at a glance the number of species dropping right down when you remove the hyphae. So they're incredibly important for a whole range of groups, not just those special and rather beautiful harvestmen, but also loads and loads of other insects. Again, an example in miniature of why rainforests are perhaps so very diverse. So that's kind of the positive side of things. And of course, rainforests, as a result of this enormous diversity, have attracted a very high number of researchers over the years. Again, I'm going to kind of focus on Wallace, a little bit of a hero of mine, because he works in exactly the same areas that I worked in the same areas that I worked in Southeast Asia. Again, in the Museum of Zoology, we're very lucky. Wallace was obviously a commercial collector in Southeast Asia, so he sent back enormous amounts of material. And we've got a lot of it in the museum in Cambridge. We've got, I think, about We've got several thousand, I think about 6,000 Wallace specimens just in the insect store. We were quite excited about this, so we phoned up Oxford Museum of Natural History, and said, we've just been doing our cataloguing, 6,000 Wallace specimens, and they said, that's fantastic, we think we've got 20,000. So he really was amazingly prolific in terms of collecting material. But of course, he travelled around Southeast Asia again. He found some amazing stuff, saw, for the first time, scientific eyes, some of these species. This is perhaps the most famous specimen, or insect specimen, I think, that Wallace discovered. This is Raja Brooke's birdwing, which he named after Raja Brooke, who he admired. Fantastic butterfly. I've seen this in the wild, really beautiful. Birdwing butterflies, of course, one of the largest species of largest groups of butterflies in the world. This is the male on the top, female on the bottom. Absolutely gorgeous things. But finding these things isn't unusual. If you work in a rainforest environment, the majority of species have perhaps yet to be formally named. So although they won't all be as large and charismatic as a Raja Brooke's birdwing, you will be finding new species all the time if you're working in these sort of environments. And Wallace, in the Malay Archipelago, again, I know you've got some fantastic records here, writes about this very nicely. And I think I suppose, again, it explains why working in a rainforest, why working in these kind of environments is so attractive, so appealing, so interesting for biologists. So this is writing about finding those Raja Brooke's birdwings. The beauty and brilliancy of the insect are indescribable, and none but a naturalist can understand the intense excitement I experienced when at length I captured it. On taking it out of my net and opening the glorious wings, my heart began to beat violently. The blood rushed to my head, and I felt much more like fainting than I have done when in apprehension of immediate death. I had a headache for the rest of the day. And you can understand why. This is an absolutely stunning thing to find, an amazing, new species to have discovered. But as I say, this will be your experience being a rainforest biologist, because of course there is this extraordinary diversity still to be discovered in these increasingly threatened habitats. This is by far the most important species to have been named in the last 20 years coming out of rainforest areas. It's a stick insect, and of course you can see why. It's Paraorthmeria turneri, it was named after me. But the point here is that finding these things is not unusual. This is a stick insect we collected from canopy fogging. We're using biodegradable insecticide to catch things up down the upper canopy. The unusual thing here is this guy, is Phil Bragg, who was the person to name this, happens to be the expert for Southeast Asian stick insects, and he was able to identify that this was indeed a new species. Because when we're dealing with these levels of diversity, it's actually very hard to tell that something's new, something's genuinely new to science. I couldn't do it, actually. I can collect things and I can tell more or less what they are, but I couldn't say that something's new. I wouldn't be able to identify a new species based on that. And of course, nowadays, taxonomists with these kind of skills are increasingly rare. Rather like the species themselves, they're becoming endangered. So there's no shortage of challenges as far as land management, as far as conservation are concerned in Southeast Asia. Rainforests are extraordinarily diverse, but they're also suffering very high levels of loss. There's kind of two main reasons for that, I suppose. One is the increasing global population. The other is an increasing shift, perhaps more importantly, in fact, an increasing shift towards a Western diet, requiring larger and larger areas to feed individual people, essentially. So increases in number, together with a shift in diet, will require a 70% increase in food production by 2050. That's if we don't start scaling this back. That means that these areas that at the moment are covered in tropical rainforests are going to be only increasingly under threat. It's not something that's about to go away. Without increasing yield, we'd need over 34 million kilometres of new agricultural land by 2050. There's no way we can support that. So there's ways around this, of course. What we're hoping for, as has happened in the past, is that yield will continue to increase per area, and that's happening so far. But there's still going to be something that has to give. And unfortunately, that something so far has been tropical rainforest. The expansion of agriculture in tropical countries has accelerated, and that's to feed this global demand. So very interesting environments, very important environments, very diverse environments, very threatened environments. So looking to the future, ultimately what we want to be trying to do is thinking about this quite carefully, researching this quite carefully, trying to come up with solutions, which means that these amazing tropical landscapes can support some of this diversity going into the future, but also enable us to feed the world. Essentially, the question becomes kind of how can you feed the world without costing the earth, I suppose. It's not just about biodiversity as well. I think we also need to be thinking quite carefully about how we can manage more sustainable functioning landscapes. This is going to be tied up to diversity too, but things which aren't increasingly degrading year on year. Can agriculture be more sustainable, essentially? At the moment, it's really not. Especially in the tropics, very, very high levels of soil erosion, things like that, meaning that these areas can't support agriculture in perpetuity. So how can we move away from that? How can we make sure that agricultural areas really are supporting high levels of crop production in 100 years, 200 years, 500 years? And I think there's various different things we have to do. That's what I'm going to try and sort of theme the main part of the talk on. I think we need to understand exactly what the effects of change are. We can understand some of them, but not all of them. We need to not just know that oil palm plantations are less diverse than forests. We need to know why. What's being lost? Because, of course, if you can understand that, you can begin to tweak the management in agricultural areas or in existing rainforest areas to try and bring some of this diversity back, if possible. Perhaps it's not possible. We need to understand how to manage agricultural areas sustainably. That's really key in the tropics. It's probably also key in the UK, to be honest, globally. We're not very good at managing agriculture in a sustainable way. We've been very, very good at increasing yield per area. That's quite a different thing. And I think we also need to be much better at engaging people. Gone are the days, I guess 20 years ago, if I'd stood up and said, I'm a conservationist, most people would have thought of me sort of strapping myself to a tree or to a whaleboat, something like that. That's very important. But nowadays, I think being a conservationist, you have to be much, much more general. There'll be everyone from whistleblowers, which are a very, very important part of conservation, to people who actually engage with industry. And that's more the side of things that I try and do, or our team tries to do with conservation. Still very much kind of aiming to save biodiversity, but one of the ways, of course, you can do that is to work more closely with industry, to try and find, or inform, I suppose, ways that you can manage agricultural areas a little bit more sustainably without potentially costing yields. Can oil palm plantations be more diverse but still as productive? And again, I think there are lots of ways we can do that. It's something, again, that just needs more work, more research, a bit more thought. So that's what I'm going to try and tell you a little bit more about. So I've already, you know all this anyway, I suspect, but I've already hinted at this. Agricultural expansion has gone off the scale in the last 30 years. I mean, some of that's a good thing. It's kind of increasing the revenue of lots of countries that really need it. Oil palm is one very good example of that. This is looking at oil palm production. The size of the circles here represent the relative levels of production. This is in the 1970s. I'm just going to zoom you through to the 1990s, through to the 2000s. The amount of production has gone off the scale in Southeast Asia. I always forget the figures, so I've written them on my hand. Shouldn't have told you. So globally, about 55 to 60 million tonnes of palm oil produced every year. That amounts to about 17 million hectares. About 80% of that, just over, is in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia and Indonesia. Indonesia is now the biggest single grower. That's an enormous expansion. The majority of that has come at the expense of forest. So there's no doubt whatsoever that this has caused a significant loss of biodiversity worldwide. It's definitely the case. And part of the reason for that, of course, is that this structural complexity that I've been talking about in forests is lost, very effectively lost, when you move from forest to oil palm plantation. This is a real forest plot, actually, so we've kind of done a sort of impression of it here. We've got these enormous tropical trees here in a rainforest, and then, of course, they're converted to an oil palm plantation. And what you do is lose all of these tree diversity, but also lose all of this structural complexity. You've got a rainforest canopy that we saw stretches in the tallest trees up to 90 metres. To something which is about 12 metres in height. You've gone from all of those hundreds of tree species per hectare to one. So, of course, perhaps not surprising that there's a loss of diversity as a result. What's perhaps more important is a big change in the microclimate that you get when you convert forest to oil palm. There's a lot of talk, of course, and very important, related to global warming worldwide, where we're talking about a few degrees change in temperature. Here, of course, in the tropics, if you convert an area of rainforest to oil palm plantation, you get an enormous shift in temperature, not over decades, but overnight. And again, that's a real challenge for species living in these kind of environments. This is data looking at oil palm plantations and forest habitats collected in Sabah, one of the projects I'm going to tell you about, the SAFE project. And what we've got here is temperature profiles. Oil palm is in grey here, and then logged forest and old growth forest, doesn't really matter. Two forests in blue and red. We've got temperature over 24 hours, and you can kind of see this here. Temperature in the forest goes from 22 degrees midday up to 25 maybe, down again at night, so as you expect. Oil palm plantation, roughly the same at night time, but look at that, up to over 30 degrees during the day. And it's really baking hot. So again, for the little things, the insects, that's incredibly difficult to survive. Some things can do it, but not the majority of species, certainly. And you also have a similar kind of mirror image here, which is the humidity in these environments. So again, you might expect rainforest area here on the floor. It's got all this amazing canopy above it. It's incredibly well buffered. It's very moist. So the humidity, rather high all the time, going down perhaps to 90% humidity during the middle of the day, but that's about it. So these are good sweaty environments. If you like it humid and close, these are the places to go for. Oil palm plantations, look at that, down to a mere 75% humidity. Still quite humid, but it's much, much lower. And of course, for insects, again, that means desiccation, drying out, death. So these environments are tough. So again, understanding exactly what's going on here can begin to sort of give us a hint about how these environments perhaps could be managed to reduce some of these negative effects. That sort of makes sense. And there's no doubt there are negative effects. This is probably the most hideous plot that I'm going to show you this evening. If you can get through this one, you're through the rest as well. So just stay with me for another couple of minutes, and then you can just let it wash over you after that. So this is a plot that Tom Fail, a colleague of mine, put together a few years ago. And this is looking at the overall effects of conversion of rainforest to oil palm on a whole range of different animal groups. These are all individual studies. So this isn't one study. This is a sort of meta-analysis, if you like, an analysis of other analyses. And what he's done here is he's done it as an arrow plot. He's plotted differences in abundance on the x-axis with differences in species richness, number of species, on the y-axis, comparing forest at the tail of the arrow to oil palm at the head of the arrow. So essentially what he's saying is if the arrow goes in this direction, from right to left, then the abundance is going down from forest to oil palm. If the arrow is going in this direction, down, from forest to oil palm, then the species richness is going down. So arrows going in this direction means that both the abundance and the diversity is going down when you compare forest to oil palm. So it makes sense. So again, if you unfocus your eyes, you can see for all of these different studies, for the majority of them, you've got exactly that pattern. Oil palm plantation is not just less diverse in terms of number of species, there's less individuals in those environments as well. And that makes a difference because, of course, these things are doing stuff. They're decomposers, they're pollinators, they're carrying out all of these different functions which makes an ecosystem tick over. Interestingly, again, like focusing in on this a little bit and understanding where the differences actually lie, what's happening, it's not the case for all of these groups. Some groups are rather unaffected. Mosquitoes, I'm pleased to hear, are rather unaffected in terms of species richness, although the abundance does go right down. In other things like dung beetles, the richness goes down, but actually the abundance can go up. So again, unpicking this, understanding where these exceptions are, can begin to give us ideas about how to manage these environments. What's making some species not be so badly affected compared to others? And if you can get a handle on that, perhaps we can get a handle on how to manage these environments a little bit more sustainably. But generally speaking, bad news as far as biodiversity is concerned. You're all well aware of that. On the flip side is the extraordinary production of oil palm. Oil palm is a very, very good crop. There's no doubt about that at all. This is looking at the average oil yield production per hectare. This is usually glossed over, I've got to say, in kind of newspaper reports, which tend to point out why oil palm is bad. Oil palm is also very good. It's very bad for biodiversity. It's very, very good in terms of oil production. So this is looking at the closest other producers. So it's, 4 or 5 times more productive per hectare than any other oil crop. And most of the oil palm goes to vegetable oil production. So everyone would have eaten palm oil this today. Actually, probably a lot of us had it in the cakes upstairs, to be honest. It's in everything. Now, the kind of flip side of this, of course, is it's very, very productive. It's fantastically good for the countries that grow it because it produces an awful lot of revenue. And of course, the countries that are growing it are often amongst the poorest countries in the world. It's incredibly important both in terms of gross revenue, also very important in terms of job production, because this is not a mechanised industry on the whole. This is providing jobs for hundreds of thousands of people. So it's good for that point of view as well. The flip side as far as conservation is concerned here is that you need a much smaller area of oil palm per area of forest cut down to produce the same amount of vegetable oil. So if we were to switch over to soybean, that sort of level of production, we'd need 6 times as much deforestation. So it's not a straightforward, it's not a kind of, let's get rid of oil palm. I think a lot of people are trying to push for that. I don't think that's necessarily a good idea. Controversially, again, I'm sort of thinking about this as a kind of shock silence. The reason is this. If we're to have the levels of vegetable oil production that we have now, if we're using it, then oil palm's got to be part of the solution to that. Whether we need as much vegetable oil production is another question entirely, and I think we probably want to be reducing that. So coming from this point of view, I think we shouldn't be kind of boycotting oil palm. If we're going to be having vegetable oil production, we do need it. We need to be thinking how to manage oil palm really carefully. We need to be thinking about where we're going to grow it. We need to be thinking quite carefully about the range of crops that are grown in different tropical countries. So I'm going to try and move on to think about that a little bit more. And I'm going to try and do it through some work that I'm involved with. It's not projects that I'm running exclusively, but it's to give you a sort of flavour for the kind of research which will give you insights into how these environments can be managed, perhaps more sustainably. I should say again, the kind of caveat with this, I think, is very, very clear. If we're to conserve tropical biodiversity, we need large, intact areas of forest. That's more or less it. That's definitely the case. The question, I think, comes with how you can manage the rest of the environment. And that's what I'm sort of trying to focus on here. So I'm going to tell you about 3 different projects which I'm involved with to varying different extents. The first is a project which is really based out of Imperial, but we do research in it as well. It's called the Stability of Altered Forest Ecosystems Project. This is a forest fragmentation project, and it's really looking at some of the impacts of deforestation, of conversion of forest to oil palm plantation. And again, what impacts that has on ecosystem functions, on the way these ecosystems work. So this is kind of like habitat change in the raw. What happens when forests are first converted? The other 2 projects I'm going to tell you about are rather different. These are the Biodiversity Ecosystem Function, Tropical Agriculture Projects, and the RERT project. These are both run out of Cambridge. And these ones are understanding much more about what happens within agricultural systems, within oil palm environments. How can you manage these areas to become more diverse? In particular, in the last one, we're beginning to work with oil palm companies to actually reforest some of these areas, to put trees back in again. So that's quite an exciting project for us. It's quite a new one. So that's why I'm going to sort of try and give you a shape, if you like, of some of the research, some of the ways you can understand the effects of rainforest loss and fragmentation, management within existing oil palm, and then the impacts of restoration. That's a sort of a kind of a shape, I suppose, a trajectory that land change can happen in these sort of environments. So I'm going to start off with SAFE. Every project to get funding instantly these days has to have an acronym of some sort. So they've all got acronyms. So this is the SAFE project, and again, I think the reason I wanted to flag it up is because I think it's a model for how research can be carried out in the future, especially in these sort of tropical countries. This isn't a study where there's a small group of scientists studying things in isolation. That's often been the model in the past. This is an incredibly inclusive project. Enormous numbers of countries involved, enormous numbers of researchers, hundreds of researchers involved. But key, I think, there's also industry. This is a project which is being carried out under the agreement of the oil palm industry and the agreement of the logging industry in Malaysia. That's quite an unusual thing even these days, because it means it's not a study which is just about understanding things from an academic point of view. It's a study which is trying to link this really directly to management. So results can be fed straight away into the oil palm industry, into the forest industry. What does this mean in terms of managing these environments more sustainably? It's quite an amazing project. This is one of these experiments you can probably see from space. So what they've done here is there's a large area, about 8,000 hectares of rainforest, which is unfortunately being converted to oil palm plantation. So bad for biodiversity, but the other side, flip side, good. researchers here from Malaysia, from the UK, from mostly Malaysia and the UK, have basically persuaded the oil palm companies here to leave forest fragments during the replanting process. In particular, these grey things here are different sizes of forest fragments. So what they've suggested, what they've encouraged the industry to do is leave small, medium and large size fragments. So these large ones being 100 hectares in size, so quite big chunks of forest left here. And also areas along all of these rivers in different scales. So what it means is that with this study, we're able to understand the actual effects of change. And not just that, management methods, leaving patches of forests, to understand how that could then benefit biodiversity in the longer term. So this is quite fun. This is quite a fun and innovative study, I think. I say it's run out of Imperial. Because it's so collaborative, it's able to look at not just one group, but a whole suite of different organisms. I mean, really, really diverse. So we've got your kind of butterflies and your larger insects. We've also got these rather interesting traps. These are called safe traps, designed for the SAFE project. But they're essentially a sort of integrated insect trap. They've been designed especially for this. So what they are is a sort of couple of interlocking plastic sheets, perspex sheets, a little pitfall trap at the bottom, and then a sort of mini tent on top. And I don't know if you've gone camping, you know, you always end up with insects on the top of your tent. It's because insects often fly up when they're trapped. This trap takes advantage of that. So if you imagine if you've got an insect walking along the ground, they're going to fall in, if they're just walking insect, they'll fall into this funnel here, and then they'll be trapped at the bottom. If you've got an insect flying along below the ground, they'll hit the perspex sheets and either drop down and be trapped, or go up and be trapped at the top here. And then the insects emerging from the ground here will be funneled into this little tent, and again trapped. So there's no escape if there are insects in these environments. But this is a very good overall way of understanding the insect diversity in these different areas. Quite a nice way of understanding exactly how habitats are changing. There's researchers working on trees, so permanent tree plots have gone into these areas to understand how tree growth, survival changes as forests are converted, as forests are fragmented. This is a flux tower. This measures canopy carbon dioxide flux over the top of canopies. And of course, we've got whole suites of researchers working on the larger bodied, the vertebrates in these systems. Beautiful bats, of course, lots of bat research going on here. This is rather a beautiful one, this bright ginger bat. It's got great big chunky teeth, and it's a beetle feeding specialist. So this is Felicia from the Philippines who works on these things. This one usually gets a bit of an R. This is the real colours for it. It's a beautiful tropical kingfisher. Not feeding on fish, of course, with these. It's very, you can see the size of it, it's tiny. These feed on insects. So a whole, and then we've also got camera traps and things going in, so a rather beautiful clouded leopard down here as well. So what you can kind of see is these sort of tropical projects where you've got proper collaboration going on means you're not just studying one thing. You can do things on a scale which wouldn't be possible otherwise, but you can almost begin to understand the whole ecosystem. And again, that's quite important in terms of these large-scale changes, because you have to understand how all these different parts of the ecosystem are fitting together. So again, it's quite good for that. I'm just going to give you a few kind of like results, the kind of things that are coming out of this work already. I'm going to concentrate more on other projects. One of the things this work's enabled us to do is to get a handle not just on how diversity is changing or abundance is changing, but rather how function is changing in these different systems. This is some very nice work by Sarah Luke, who works on ants and termites. And what she was able to do is sample across the different habitats in the SAFE project and show how the abundances of ants and termites changed. But also, it doesn't really matter what they stand for. These different colours are different functional groups of ants and termites. Essentially, they're groups of ants and termites that are doing different things in the ecosystem. And she was able to show very convincingly that they also change. And then subsequently, she was able to link those to changes in things like decomposition, in things like herbivory within these different environments. So again, that's only possible by having this kind of holistic approach. More recently, we've started to put in mini experiments, if you like, to understand a little bit more about how these ecosystems work. And this is quite a fun one as well. This is using then now data from loads and loads of researchers who've all been working on this project for probably 5 or 6 years now. This is looking at kind of key ecosystem functions which were measured in all of these different habitats. And what we're doing here is we're looking at decomposition, so how quickly leaf litter decomposes in environments, seed predation, so how quickly seeds are removed and eaten, and then this is predation of insects. what we did here was basically put out little, you can buy mealworms for birds, these little kind of little grubs that birds will eat. You can put them out into a rainforest and you can see how quickly they're eaten. So they're quite a good measure, again, of how predation is changing. And what we did here overall was exclude insects from primary forest in green and secondary forest in yellow. So what you can see here, at the top here, is no change in decomposition, no change in seed predation, no change in mealworm removal, comparing forest in green and log forest in yellow. And one of the things that turns out here is that when you start excluding it, it has more of an effect in the primary forest than it does in the log forest. So what that suggests is that as a result of this degradation, this movement from a primary forest to a log forest, the insects are becoming less important. And again, that's quite a key finding for us. So it suggests that insects are gradually reducing their importance as habitats become more degraded. The likelihood is that this is related to loss of insects, of course. So in these pristine environments, there's tons of them everywhere. As they start to decline, their importance in terms of these processes also goes down. And that's quite a worrying message because, of course, they underpin a lot of the different functions which are important. Things like decomposition, things like pest control, things like nutrients recycling. So that's a bit of a flavour for the SAFE project. I'm going to move on now and think a little bit more about how habitats operate within these agricultural systems themselves. So thinking a bit more about the BEFTA project, again, acronyms, very important, funding, yep. This is a project we've been running really, really closely associated with the oil palm industry. Again, we're completely independent, but the industry here is interested in finding out how their ecosystems work, essentially. It's been quite an interesting one for us, because by getting more involved, I suppose, with the agricultural side of things, we've been able to tie this research directly into yield, which is one of the things we've been very much interested in. This project in itself is particularly looking at the importance of structural complexity within agricultural habitats. So we're working here in Sumatra, so we're across the border. The SAFE project is based in Sabah in Malaysia. This is Sumatra in Indonesia. And if you were to, I suppose, if you were to stick a pin in the place in the world which has got the highest amount of oil palm, it would probably fall pretty close to our study plots in Sumatra. This is an area which has been more or less completely cleared of rainforest and converted to oil palm plantation. So this is quite an interesting environment for us because it represents a bottom level, really. This is basically as degraded as a habitat can get as far as biodiversity is concerned. So we're very keen to work here with the oil palm companies because it enabled us to basically see what could we do to increase diversity in an environment that's been really as changed as it could be. No forest left at all. So what we did, and we persuaded the oil palm company to do, was to change their management in certain plots, again, replicated plots across the environment. We had 6 different replicas, and each one of these I'm going to zoom into. We encouraged the oil palm company to manage their oil palm in different ways. If you look around different oil palm plantations, they're really quite different in terms of how they look. And one of the key things that you notice as you drive around the States is what the understory of oil palm looks like. So oil palm itself is a very long-lived crop. It can last 25 years, something like that. And really, it's a perennial crop. Some plantations, it's completely bare in the understory. And the reason for that is that some plantations spray it very heavily with herbicides. Other plantations, it's somewhere in between, like these. In others, it's almost like a little jungle. And of course, that's really variable. So again, we were interested in finding out whether that actually had an effect as far as biodiversity concerned, whether that had effect in terms of yield. So we persuaded the oil palm company to set this up experimentally for us. What we had was quite large plots, 150 metres by 150 metres. This is a scale we couldn't probably do without this industry involvement. And we collected loads of data on all of our different plots, and then after a year or so, we persuaded them to change the management. In particular, we had plots where they increased the spraying, so we had a kind of like a poor management, I suppose, or a reduced diversity management here. We had a kind of business as usual, which in the estates we were working in was oil palm being sprayed around the base of the tree to enable people to get in and harvest the fruits and things like that. But no more spraying elsewhere. And then we had a sort of regrowth where we persuaded the companies to stop spraying any herbicides in their understory at all. And we were interested in seeing what the effects were. This again is something which I think rather like some agricultural areas in the UK, actually, industry can be sometimes a bit slow to change. We've asked lots of industry growers, why do you spray all the understory? And often it's about tidiness. It looks bad to not have a clear understory. So to be able to kind of counter that, of course, you need evidence. And that's what we were looking at here. Is there a way, essentially, of managing an oil palm plantations to still maintain that very high yield? That's really important for the plantations. It's important for the countries involved. It's also important in terms of reducing demand of new forest areas being cleared. But can you tweak it? Can you change the management to make it a little bit more biodiverse, a little bit more sustainable? That's our motivation behind this. So we set up the plots in 2012, applied the treatments in 2014. We've been collecting data since then, understanding the effects of these long-term changes. And it's been quite fun. Again, rather like the SAFE project, once you set up a large experiment like this, you suddenly get loads more people being interested in being involved. So from the Cambridge end, we mostly work on insects, of course, the most important and interesting group there is. But I'm aware that people like to study other things like birds. So we've had people come in from Singapore, in fact, National University of Singapore, studying birds. We've had a lot of industry involvement. Research arms of the oil palm industry helping us study things like herbivory levels, things like yield. We've had climate scientists come in to take those sort of measurements. So again, these sort of projects encourage more collaboration. It's almost a side product of setting up these experiments. It gets people talking. So it's been really fun. We've had researchers from Oxford studying dung beetles as well. So all kinds of different things and removal. We've also had researchers working on kind of key groups of predators for us as well. So frogs, transect walks around our plots looking for numbers and abundances of frogs. Groups working on assassin bugs. There's very important 2 species of assassin bugs found in the plantations, which are very important for pest control. And the industry actually breeds them up at quite huge expense sometimes and releases them to control caterpillars. Quite amazing stuff. And we've had researchers working on spiders as well, very high numbers of spiders in these plantations. That's what a frog looks like. This is what the assassin bugs look like. They're really rather beautiful. There's 2 key species. This is something called Sucanus, and this is Cospolestes. These are 2 really important and quite expensive to produce assassin bugs in the plantations. These are my personal favourite. I absolutely love these. These are golden orb web spiders, and they're just beautiful. I don't know how many of you like spiders. That's good. So these are more or less, if you don't like spiders, these probably aren't for you. They're really huge. So that sort of size. And their webs are perfectly positioned so that the spiders sit more or less at face height. So they're great for looking at. And if you don't pay attention in the estates, you end up with them literally on your face. They're harmless, actually. But they're very, very important, we think, predators, because their numbers are absolutely off the scale in some of these plantation habitats. And again, understanding how they work, how they can be controlling potentially pest species is particularly important. They're really, really beautiful. They've also got some fascinating biology as well. And you can see here, this is the big female, and she's eating a termite here, which is actually a pest species, so it's quite a nice photo for that reason. But what you can see here on the edge here, see that little spider? This is the same size as the males. The males themselves almost are like parasites living in the female's webs. They steal the female's food. They're only a tiny fraction of the size. This is actually a different species, though. This is a kleptoparasite spider, a thing called Agrioides, which, again, you can get in the plantations here, you can get 20 or 30 of these spiders all living in these very large females' webs, and they literally steal the food. So as soon as something is caught by the spiders, they'll all rush over and try and eat it as well. And of course, that makes them important predators too. So we've been studying these in quite a lot of detail as well, because again, of course, structural complexity can be really important for these spiders, because they use them to build their webs. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about some of that. Of course, we ultimately also want to link this to function. It's interesting from our point of view for understanding how structure can affect biodiversity, but from the manager's point of view, of course, what they want is a bottom line. Does this mean more production? Does this mean more pest control? Does this mean I don't have to apply so many pesticides? And that's really important. It's important for us because that's obviously going to have a benefit in terms of the environment. It's important for the managers because pesticides are probably the single most expensive thing they have to do in their plantation, pesticides and fertilizers. So if you can reduce that cost, you actually increase profitability. So it's almost like a win-win-win situation. if you can get that. So we study a whole range of ecosystem processes similar to the Summer Safe project. We've got the safe traps in again. We're also looking at the seed predation, herbivory damage on the fronds. The oil palm industry is doing that for us. We can also look for spiders at consumption rates, of course. Because the prey stay in the webs for a little while, you can go around and essentially identify them, find out whether the number of prey items is changing with different management types, that sort of thing. And ultimately, again, the kind of collaboration with industry here, the key thing we can get is yield. Because, of course, what we don't want to be doing is recommending a management which reduces yield, because that could mean more deforestation elsewhere. So it's always working within those kind of premises. So can we come up with situations where there's a benefit, both in terms of production and in terms of biodiversity? And I'm going to just talk you through a few of the results for this. And it turns out there are lots of different potential benefits. So first of all, when our treatments worked, I suppose, the vegetation goes down when you spray more pesticides. Interestingly, if you leave them, the vegetation does go up, but not so hugely as you might imagine. There's an increase in biomass, but actually these systems are quite stable. So again, that was something that surprised the oil palm industry. They thought it was going to be really disastrous as far as getting to their crops were concerned. Actually, it wasn't. They were able to harvest perfectly reasonably without using any herbicides, which is quite a surprising result in its own right, because they've been spraying to enable them to harvest. So again, that's a cost you can just slash immediately. It's a sort of side product. One of the things that really interested us was the quite high diversity that we identify from oil palm. And again, in the papers, you tend to read as oil palm as being green deserts. They're not. They're full of species. It's just they're not as diverse as rainforests. Nowhere near as diverse as a rainforest. I mean, an example here, we had dragonfly transects looking at the number of dragonfly species in these plots. We found something like, 46 species just from our plots. That's about the same as the UK. But we're talking just our single plots just within an oil palm, not the wider oil palm landscape. So it's quite extraordinary numbers for what's an agricultural system. So it's not kind of these aren't important rainforest species on the whole, but there's still diversity. They're still doing stuff. So understanding the function of this can be quite important. And we picked up quite a lot of new records as well. So 3 new records from Sumatra for our plots. That's mostly because these areas are so understudied. What we did find, really convincingly, was that increasing the structural complexity increased the number of species or number of individuals across loads of different groups of predators. That was our kind of most convincing finding, and it continues to be. This is probably the major kind of native rat predator in oil palm plantations. It's rather a beautiful thing called a leopard cat. Very, very high numbers in the plantations we worked in. And what we found was basically if you have more understory, it's enhanced plots with more understory, there are consistently higher numbers of leopard cats. They move in, they love it there. So the pest control in terms of eating rats, which are very important pests in oil palm, goes up. So important for large-bodied things. We didn't really expect this actually because our plots are quite small. And they are really lovely, these things. They're absolutely gorgeous. Higher numbers of frogs as well. Abundance and number of diversity of frogs is higher in the plots with more understory compared to those without. So frogs benefit from having more structural complexity and understory. Not surprising, but again, of course, these frogs are eating lots of these pest insects. So again, potentially important for pest control there. The assassin bugs, their numbers drop hugely if you remove the understory. They go up if you let the understory regrow. This is really interesting for the oil palm industry, of course, because they're busy breeding these things up and releasing them. Of course, what they could do is just let their understory regrow. So again, it's a good result here because it's quite useful for biodiversity side of things, but it also means that oil palm industry is getting a benefit out of it. So again, it's a sort of that kind of win-win situation, I suppose, where you can benefit both the number of species in the environment, but also the pest control. Another thing we found again was that the spiders go up. So enhanced plots here have got higher numbers of understory spiders than the standard plots, than the reduced plots. So again, same sort of pattern. These are very different groups, incidentally. But it's that structural complexity, kind of going back to the beginning of the talk, and we're thinking about structure being important, the complexity being important, where it turns out it really is, not just for one group, but for whole suites of different predators in this case. So again, kind of benefits in that sort of way. And of course, the rather beautiful Nephila spiders, higher numbers in the enhanced and the normal plots than there are in the reduced. This is over time here, but you can see the kind of numbers are dropping. This is because we were monitoring over an El Nino event, so a very dry event, so the numbers went down. They go up again afterwards, actually. So the spiders themselves, these beautiful Nephila, go up in abundance when you've got more complex understory habitat. And again, that has knock-on effects, because when there's more Nephila, of course, you get higher prey consumption rates. You get higher numbers of pest species and things being eaten both per hour and per hectare in these plots with more understory compared to those without. And you also get higher numbers of these rather lovely cryptoparasites as well. So not just higher numbers of just one predator, that's having knock-on effects. It's increasing the number of other things which are relying on these predators themselves. So you can kind of see where this is going. There's ways, it seems quite a lot of ways, that you can tweak the management within these oil palm systems and increase not just the diversity of predators, but also kind of other knock-on effects for the ecosystem. And ultimately, that also led to reduced herbivory levels. It doesn't look kind of super convincing here, but it's actually quite a lot. We got kind of lower, about 9%, 10% lower herbivory levels where you've got these enhanced plots. That's almost certainly to do with these predators. So this is feeding through to something which can really cost the industry. We've started to kind of like build on this a bit more. I wanted to put in some kind of extra work we've done. We've been doing some extra quite fun tweaks again in these systems. This is Millie Hoods, one of our PhD students in Cambridge, who's been kind of putting up these amazing ant exclusion barriers. So she's been trying to understand how particularly certain predators within these groups, particularly ants, can benefit things like pest control. This is an enormous effort on Millie's part. It's fantastic things. There's researchers from the oil palm industry here, and Millie as well, who've built these incredible barriers, which are covered in sort of sticky glue. And what she basically does is remove ants from the middle here, and then seal off the palms. And she's able to basically look at the levels of herbivore control, soil, nutrient turnover, all kinds of things in these plots compared to control plots. So directly actually test this stuff, which is getting some very nice early results. In particular, it turns out these ants, again, are incredibly important for pest control, like far more than we might have imagined before actually manipulating this. This is looking at before and after here, control plots in red, exclusion plots in blue. And you can see before, they kind of all overlap. There's quite equal numbers of mealworms removed, equal numbers of predation. But then when you exclude the ants, suddenly the number of mealworms eaten kind of drops. So we're able to show that sort of 80 or 90% of the pest control that's going on in the plantations was actually to do with these ants. And again, that's important as far as managers are concerned, because suddenly they start valuing the things which are actually living in the oil palm ecosystem. They're providing, if you like, a service all for free. They're controlling their pests without them even being aware of it. It's particularly important in the oil palm industry because there's a few plans to try and reduce the number of ants because they can be quite irritating sometimes. So again, understanding these things means you can understand a little bit more about what's actually going on in terms of how these ecosystems work. These are horrible plots, but what I just put these in to show is yield over the years. Yield goes up and down, mostly with rainfall. But what I want you to just do is unfocus your eyes and notice that the three different habitat treatments we've got here, enhanced, normal, and reduced, they overlap completely. So we're not increasing yield here, but we're also not reducing yield. So we're able to basically make a much more diverse system with absolutely no cost in terms of production. And in fact, a big saving in terms of reduced herbicides and reduced pesticides. So what I'm trying to show with this is there's lots of ways, there's gaps here within agricultural systems in the tropics that you can sort of exploit if you can understand the system properly. There are ways that you can grow crops more productively and at higher biodiversity. These things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. In fact, I think from the work here, what we're showing is actually they go hand in hand. A crop can be more biodiverse, but it can also be more productive, or at least the same level of production. Just to kind of finish off then, I want to sort of this is a project we've only just got started going, but again, I think it shows, again, some of the value of sort of working in this kind of niche, working with the oil palm industry a bit more closely. And that's this again, I'm so sorry about the acronyms, RERTA project this time. But this is the Riparian Restoration Project. And what we're doing here is we've persuaded oil palm industry, I'm going to zoom through this actually, persuaded oil palm industry to allow us to restore riparian margins. This is now law in a lot of the guidelines for Malaysia and Indonesia. So plantation companies are expected to restore river margins to replant it. But at the moment, there's no instructions at all about how they could go about doing that. What they're mostly doing at the moment is just leaving mature oil palm. So when oil palm gets to about 25 years old, it's replanted. That has potential costs as well. And what they're doing at the moment is just leaving areas of it, about 50 metres on each side of a river, and they're expecting it to regenerate. Now, that can happen, but it depends very much where you are. So the question here is, how can you speed that up? What can you do easily with an oil palm to allow forest trees to regenerate? There's no doubt there's all sorts of benefits to having rainforest trees around river areas. That's certainly the case. I mean, the big thing is things like reduced erosion and stuff. That's quite well known. What we're really wanting to find out with this study is how can you do this management most effectively, and what's the other benefits? Of course, this is like our understory study, but on a really grand scale. We're not just allowing understory herb plants to regrow. We're putting in a whole new forest. That's not been looked at before. So again, we're working with the oil palm to really test this. In particular, this is Sarah Luke and Anna Gung here, who are the two researchers from our side and from the industry side, who are basically working together to put up this project. It's literally just gone in last month. So it's quite an exciting one for us. So we spent the last year studying several rivers across our catchment area, and now these areas are being cleared and replanted with oil palms, existing oil palm already. And what we've done is we've put in different treatments. We've put in areas where the old oil palm's been left, the usual industry practice, but we've replanted in the understory with a mix of rainforest trees. Got other areas where we've just kept the mature oil palm. We're basically seeing what turns up. Other areas where we've cleared but planted forest trees, little baby forest trees right up to the margin. And other areas which are our control, where the palms have just been replanted to the river edge. That's industry practice if you're not trying to restore rivers. So we're basically trying again, we're working with the industry in this case to basically find out how best to manage these sort of systems to try and get more benefits in terms of restoring river margins. And I should say it's often government law in Malaysia and Indonesia to restore river margins now. But it's also something which is remarkably little known. So we're hoping the results here will be kind of interest to ecologists, to researchers like ourselves, but also to the industry. So it's making sure it's got that kind of practical outcome. And I think there's no doubt it's going to have a beneficial effect, because the rivers at the moment, they're not beautiful places. So there's plenty of room for restoration here. You can see kind of what they look like with the oil palm right to the edge, very, very high levels of erosion. And again, we're measuring everything. Again, setting up big experiments, you immediately get other researchers wanting to be involved. So very good collaboration possibilities. Lots of different aspects being measured. So I think I'm nearly out of time. So I'm am I? Leanne, how close am I to time? Am I already out of time? Or out of time? Okay. In that case, luckily I'm on to my last two slides, so that's okay. So what I wanted to try and sort of finish off with, I've tried to hopefully give you a little bit of an overview of why rainforests are interesting, why they're threatened, why agriculture is more complicated than you might imagine, and what you can try and do to try and make agriculture more diverse, a little bit more like a rainforest. And again, I should say, we're not restoring rainforest here at all. We're trying to work within those bounds. What can you do to make agriculture more diverse, but at the same time more productive? The sideline of all this, of course, being right in the middle of all this, between research, conservation, and agriculture, is there's a fantastic chance for collaboration. That's the thing we've really found here. And you can kind of see this at a glance. These are our three projects. And you can see the number of researchers that are involved with the different projects, the number of institutions, the number of graduate students who have been involved, and the kind of direct links there have been in terms of developing collaborations between industry, between countries. We've had a whole load of publications, of course, which are not just in the scientific literature, but in the agronomic industry, within the oil palm literature. And we've also ended up arranging lots of study tours. This is a recent study tour from a couple of months ago, which, as a result, again, of this collaboration, we set up a tour for researchers from Papua New Guinea, from Malaysia, from Indonesia, who are all working on oil palm-related projects. And what they did was tour around each of their different study areas to find out, basically to share good ideas. We've increasingly, with the museum involvement, started doing more school engagement work. And particularly Sarah Steele is the engagement person in the museum up here, has done fantastic work, again, linking some of these projects, not just between schools in Malaysia and Indonesia, but also with schools here in the UK as well. This is our recent project, which we've just finished, which was Sarah went out, and we had her on tour with our orangutan here, which had a blog for the whole time. He's surprisingly good at blogging, of his tour around the different oil palm and forest areas in Malaysia and Indonesia. And particularly visited lots of schools both in Cambridge and also in Indonesia and Malaysia, and they exchanged pictures of the biodiversity they find in their different environments. They also chose the name of the orangutan as well, which is quite fun. But again, this is sort of stuff we weren't originally planning when we set up this project. It's really rather a result of having all of these different people involved. It's really fantastic engagement. The kids' drawings were absolutely amazing. I could actually identify what insects they were from their drawings. It's extraordinary. So that's me genuinely finished. So hopefully what I've tried to do is give you a bit of an overview. Hopefully I've tried to get you to think a little bit more about oil palm and what it's the good as well as the bad side of it. It does have very bad sides, but it's not something I think to be boycotted from that point of view. Rather, it's something to understand. Thank you.